Débat, the honourable member for Toronto-Danforth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to start by indicating I'll be splitting my time with the member for Rimouski, Neguet, Témiscouata, Les Basques. As with all my other colleagues, it's my pleasure to rise today to have the privilege of being able to speak on a day such as this after the tragic events of yesterday. I've had a chance outside of this chamber to express my appreciation to the security services of the House of Commons, Mr. Constable Samern Son, who actually suffered a wound trying to stop the attacker from entering this honourable place, and especially Sergeant at Arms Vickers, who ended the threat. I'd like to also say that on a day like today, after a day like yesterday, given the subject of this Bill C-35, an act to amend the Criminal Code, law enforcement animals, military animals, and service animals, that my mind is drawn to a monument not far from where Corporal Cerrito was murdered. Just a little farther down the street, down Elgin, and to the left is Confederation Park, where you will find, since 2012, the Animals in War Monument. It's a very poignant monument. It shows a German Shepherd, I believe it is, dog, from World War I, with a kind of a cape that contains various items that the war dog was assisting a soldier carrying. There's a picture on the day of dedication of RCMP Corporal Luc Patenaude and his own police dog, Cujo, standing alongside the war dog cemetery. I'd like to read, if I might, Mr. Speaker, the Animals in War plaque, which I think is highly relevant to the whole idea of sacrifice that we were reminded of yesterday, and the theme of sacrifice, and actually ultimately a fundamental humanity of a relationship with animals that the member for Kootenay so eloquently spoke of. The plaque says the following, quote, "For centuries, animals have demonstrated an enduring partnership with humans during times of war. They have served as a means of transportation, beasts of burden, messengers, protectors, and mascots. Still, today, dogs use their unique, sharply tuned instincts to detect mine clusters and conduct search and rescue operations. We remember the contribution and sacrifice of all animals." End of quotation. I think it's a marvelously done monument, and I think it helps, again, remind us of this connection between animals and ourselves. The way we treat animals in our society, Mr. Speaker, is also a measure of our own humanity. And sadly, I believe our criminal laws, and not to mention provincial laws across this country, are sadly lagging behind other jurisdictions. As someone who counts an animal, and I'm proud to say it, happy to say it literally as a member of my family, that's the way I think of it, just with respect to my mini schnauzer, I personally believe that animals' presence in our lives humanizes our existence. We can just think of some of the examples my colleague from Sudbury gave, the detailed stories from the member of Kootenay about the particular importance of animals in the police services. But we can also think of animal therapy in seniors' homes, hospitals, and so on, that increasingly is recognized as part of advanced cutting-edge therapy, going back to basics being part of the future. I was touched how the member of Kootenay spoke. He used the word murder, and he emphasized that a couple times in his speech and then in the answers to his questions. He wants us to not think of this as just the killing of an animal, the death of an animal, but the murder. And you don't use that language unless you're talking about a profound relationship, where partnership, friendship, and even a familial bond is part of how you think about the loss of that animal. And from my perspective, I think the member for Kootenay hit the nail exactly on the head. This is exactly how we should be thinking of animals in the professions, effectively, that he has listed: enforcement animals, military animals, and service animals. We also have to remember that in certain contexts, the war dog being one example, but police dogs in particular being another, that it's not just that they're partners, but if we're honest with ourselves, the form of service that they represent is sacrificial, that they are deployed in circumstances that can lead to them being more likely to suffer harm, if not be killed, than their partner, or to use another language, their handlers. And so the idea of something extra being owed to these animals is something that I have absolutely no problem with. But I do think that the understanding behind this bill can't stop at the gates of these particular animals. I think that if we push further on exactly what's motivating the extra protection for these animals in the circumstances in which they can be hurt or killed, we would find ourselves thinking about animal rights in a very different way across the board. We would be thinking about cruelty to animals in Canada in a broader frame. And so, Mr. Speaker, I would remind you as Deputy Speaker, but Mr. Speaker, that you introduced a private member's bill, C-414, which has now been taken up by the member from Notre-Dame-de-Grâce-Lachine. And you tabled that bill, Mr. Speaker, on the very day that I was sworn in this House, and it was my distinct pleasure to second that bill. And I would like to quote, for the benefit of everybody in the House, words you said in introducing it. Quote, "This bill would do two basic things. It first recognizes that animals are sentient beings as opposed to a piece of wood or a piece of furniture, which is the way the criminal code currently treats them. The other thing that it would do has a very clear consequence. The number of convictions for animal cruelty would increase dramatically under the criminal code. We have estimates that only 1 in 1,000 cases of animal cruelty can result in convictions under the criminal code, and this would address that issue." So the bill that I referred to that is now being taken up by what I think is currently C-592 is part of an NDP commitment as a strong advocate for ending all levels of cruelty to animals, including such things as forced breeding. And this can only be accomplished by repealing old sections of the criminal code dealing with animal cruelty and proposing newer, tougher laws to protect animals. But I do believe that it can't be done only on a piecemeal basis. It has to be done by government legislation to create a proper overhaul. Now, this bill is, although a government bill, it is in the mode of piecemeal legislation. And I would very much like to urge the government to think about the potential for this bill to be the start of something that is more of an overhaul, that looks at the picture from a more general perspective than simply this deserving case of service, police enforcement, and military animals. Mr. Speaker, I have how much time left?
1 minute, 40 seconds.
Thank you. And with that, I'd like to emphasize that the bill has my full support to go to committee. I believe my colleagues have the same view on that. But I would urge the movers of the bill and my colleagues from Richmond Hill and Kootenay who have taken the lead on it to ask whether or not the elements of mandatory minimums and necessary mandatory consequential sentencing are really needed for what they're trying to do. They have the support of this side of the House. The key is to actually criminalize in a way that can't be avoided from a prosecution point of view, and to make sure that the ability to prosecute in the right circumstances is there. The idea of taking discretionary judgment away from judges when it comes to sentences seems to me to be an entirely different issue from what ultimately was motivating my colleague across the way in his speech. It's frankly simply not necessary for what he is trying to achieve. And the last thing is that, yet again, this is a bill that, because it has mandatory minimums, will raise issues around constitutionality. It once again reminds us that we have bills coming before this House where we have to rely on the competence and the good faith of the Minister of Justice to have vetted the bill to make sure that it actually meets the current constitutional standards for sentencing. And I can never be convinced that that's the case because we never see the legal opinions. I would be, once again, this is the third time in 2 weeks I've asked the government to consider a committee introducing the legal opinion that was given to make sure that this particular mandatory minimum would not offend the Charter. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.